Afternoon. Today I'm going to be reading from The Mystery of the Coniunctio, Alchemical Image of Individuation by Dr. Edward F. Edinger. Now, what we need to understand about these 10 images that are in the Rosarium Philosophorum that was published in 1550 by Gerhard Dorn is that they represent the psychological development of an individual, of a couple, and of a community at large. And so that can include anything from a Boy Scout troop to a church, to a state, to a country, to all the humanity in the world. And so these 10 images take us through the the psychological cycle of psychological development in those entities. So here I'm on picture 7, and this represents kind of the early stage of the second half of life, after the midlife crisis, let's say. At least that's my understanding. I'm not a mental health professional, as I have said many times, and so I'm just giving you my interpretation from a layman's point of view. Hi, Buzz, welcome. Okay, so picture 7. Separation of soul and body. Now things become a little more complex again. More elements enter the picture. We have the same slab tomb with the united body lying on it, but in addition, a tiny little figure is ascending from the body into a cloud that has appeared above the tomb. This is a representation of the age-old image of the soul separating from the body at the moment of death. You find this pictured very graphically in some of the old texts. In Homer, for instance, as the individual died, onlookers thought they actually saw a little smoke-like wreath leave the mouth of the dying body and ascend, and that was understood as the soul departing the body at the moment of death. It was very much associated with the breath, of course, because breathing in and out is evident that the soul still occupies the body. When the breathing stops, then the soul has left the body. I've heard of several similar experiences of people witnessing a death and having a vivid sense of the soul leaving the body, very often associated with wind-like qualities. Psychologically, it corresponds in smaller ways, anyway, to what happens when any sizable identification or projection breaks down. A piece of the psyche separates from the concrete corporeal container. You know, as long as we have pieces of our psyche deposited, like bank deposits actually, in various objects or activities or people in our outside environment, as long as that's the case, then there's a free flow of life, a kind of breathing between ourselves and those parts of our exteriorized psyche. Life goes on. One is interested and alive, and things flow. Now, if any of those containers of one's psyche dies, one goes through a grief reaction because a piece of oneself dies at the same time. A kind of separation is required. One has to take back that piece of one's own psyche from the person who has died, otherwise it will pull us into the grave too. The same thing can happen when a person or object dies for us psychologically. It doesn't have to be a literal death. There's a psychological death when the projection that has been carried for us drops off. A piece of ongoing life we were used to has disappeared, and we are, in effect, dead until that missing piece of our psyche is recovered. That's the sort of process Figure 7 represents. And I recall a scene from a movie or a television series that was done by Aaron Sorkin. I think it was called The Network. And in that series, in the very first show, there's a scene where the newscaster, the anchorman, is asked to say why the United States is the greatest country in the world, because that's a projection that many Americans have. And the answer was, it's not. Okay. And yet many of us had that projection for many years, for decades after World War II. And it's only in recent years, as we've psychologically divided ourselves between red states and blue states, that's died. That projection of America is the greatest country in the world is dead, gone now. And so the question is, how do we revivify it? How are we reborn? And that is coming up in the next two images. And but first we have to recognize that psychological container is gone, and then something new organically grows out of it, which we're seeing happen before our eyes on our cable news channels every night. I came across quite a striking dream example of this image. Some years ago, I made a move from New York to California, which involved a certain upset for some of my patients I was working with. As you can imagine, keep in mind now, we're talking about different levels in this book. And this is the book, The Mystery of the Coniunctio. And so we're talking about an individual, or possibly a couple, or possibly the whole country, or any other organization. It could be the church, could be the Boy Scout troop. So here, Dr. Edinger is talking about an individual. And he says, I came across quite a striking dream example of this image. Some years ago, I made a move from New York to California, which involved a certain upset for some of the patients I was working with, as you can imagine. One particular patient, on the day I was going to inform him about my move 2 months hence, the very day I was going to tell him, brought me this dream. Quote, I was watching the following scene. I saw my own corpse laid out on a stretcher, and as though in demonstration, the flesh fell off the bones of my leg. It was like seeing a chicken where the flesh fell away easily from the bone. I said to myself, that is my corpse. Then a voice said, the soul needs an hour to leave the body. It is important that you help keep the body together for an hour until the soul can make a proper exit. This remark was presumably directed to an attendant, and then, again, as though in demonstration, something cloud-like or vaporous was sucked up out of my mouth. There's an ancient image repeated in a modern dream. It was immediately evident to me that the dream referred to what I hadn't yet told my patient. And of course, it told me that things must not be done too hastily, because the soul needs an hour to leave the body. The dreamer's association to an hour was an analytical hour. I don't think it was just for this reason alone, but I did arrange things so that for a year or more I commuted between New York and California and terminated the analysis very gradually. It worked out all right, but isn't it astonishing that the unconscious could present a dream of this depth and import. To me, it was a measure of the fact that the analytical process was absolutely crucial to this man, a matter of life and death. Now, there are 4 pictures in the Rosarium series, pictures 6, 7, 8, and 9, showing the death, the separation, and ascent of the soul, and then the return of the soul, that have a very definite correspondence to the 3 stages of the Coniunctio discussed by Jung in the long last chapter of Mysterium Coniunctionis. I want to summarize briefly the contents of that chapter for you because I think it is essential to an adequate understanding of these pictures. With the help of a lot of alchemical texts, chiefly those from the alchemist Gerhard Dorn, Jung demonstrates that the alchemical Coniunctio actually takes place in 3 stages. I'll just give you the bare bones of those stages. The first stage involves the union of soul and spirit, which takes place simultaneously with the separation of body and soul. It's a twofold operation in which the soul separates from the body and in the process of that separation unites with the spirit. This stage is given the Latin term unio mentalis. That simply means mental union, but let's use the Latin to indicate that we're talking about the technical first stage of the Coniunctio, the union of soul and spirit. Yes, we're talking about picture 7, Grenade. Martin says it's classed as liminal. I think most of these discussions of Jung's work are liminal in the sense that they are on the boundary between consciousness and unconsciousness. Buzz comments, my name is Osmondius, look on my works and weep. I don't remember what that reference is, Buzz, but it's interesting when I do remember that phrase. That picture reminds me of the end of Romeo and Juliet, yeah. Okay, so in the second stage of the Coniunctio, the unio mentalis, that entity which combines soul and spirit, reunites with the body. So now we have a union of soul, spirit, and body. That's the second stage of the Coniunctio. In the third stage, that spirit, soul, body unity combines with the unus mundus, or let's say it unites with the world and thereby brings about what Jung calls the unus mundus, which just means one world. Now, that's not quite enough to understand what's being referred to in the last Rosarium pictures. We need a little bit more. The first step involves the separation of the soul from the body, and then the other half of that step, the union of soul and spirit, happens automatically. Jung says about this, quote, in order to bring about their subsequent reunion, the mind must be separated from the body, which is equivalent to voluntary death, for only separated things can unite. This involves a discrimination and dissolution of the composite state being one in which the effectivity of the body has a disturbing influence on the rationality of the mind. The aim of this separation was to free the mind from the influence of bodily appetites and the heart's affections, and to establish a spiritual position which is supraordinate to the turbulent sphere of the body. This leads at first to a dissociation of the personality and a violation of the merely natural man. This preliminary step, in itself a clear blend of Stoic philosophy and Christian psychology, is indispensable for the differentiation of consciousness. Modern psychotherapy makes use of the same procedure when it objectifies the effects and instincts and confronts consciousness with them. Unquote. What that means is that the vital first stage of the Coniunctio, the dissociation between the spiritual pole of the psyche and the bodily pole, must be complete. You could say that that's what the last 2,000 years or more of cultural history has been working on. The first stage of the Coniunctio. It started with the Stoic philosophers, and Christianity picked it up. As Nietzsche very cleverly put it, Christianity is Platonism for the people. But it has been part of the effort to bring about a thorough first stage of the Coniunctio. When that's been brought about, one is immune from being possessed by the bodily affections. That's what it amounts to. Of course, one is split, and the images that go to picture this first stage are such things as decapitation, not very agreeable. But when the stage has been fully achieved, the effects have been contained. Then the second stage takes on importance, reuniting the unio mentalis with the body. That means everything that one had to dissociate from at the previous stage has to be reincorporated at a new level of consciousness. You have to do everything you did before, let the same energies back in, but they are altogether different because they're accompanied by consciousness. In effect, those energies and their sources have undergone a death and rebirth. They've been regenerated. First, they've been killed, and then they've been reborn. Okay, so that's what's so painful about our current political situation, in that the projection of America as the greatest country in the world is dead right now, and we're waiting for the new being of United We Stand to be born and emerge. The third stage of the Coniunctio, called the union with the Unus Mundus, I'll say a little more about when we come to picture 10, but I think it's beyond our power to describe very specifically, because it signifies a union with the totality that probably belongs only, in really full sense, with the experience of death. Speaking of Plato, I want to read you a particularly pertinent remark about the nature of death. Here's how the Greek philosophers thought of death, and it's absolutely relevant to the nature of the first stage of the Coniunctio. This is Socrates speaking while he's waiting in prison to die after drinking hemlock. Quote, "Is not what we call death a freeing and separation of the soul from the body? And the desire to free the soul is found chiefly, or rather only, in the true philosopher. In fact, the philosopher's occupation consists precisely in the freeing and separation of soul from body. If a man has trained himself throughout his life to live in a state as close as possible to death, would it not be ridiculous for him to be distressed when death comes to him?" Unquote. And here's the punchline, quote, "True philosophers make dying their profession, and to them of all men death is least alarming. If they are thoroughly dissatisfied with the body and long to have their souls independent of it, that states in a nutshell the first stage of the Coniunctio. When this happens, would it not be entirely unreasonable to be frightened and distressed? would they not naturally be glad to set out for the place where there is a prospect of attaining the object of this lifelong desire, which is wisdom, and of escaping from an unwelcome association, unquote. This is a marvelous example of the whole human effort to set up a spiritual counterpole against nature, body, and instinct. It belongs to our finest cultural tradition and is relevant to the first stage of the Coniunctio, and psychologically what it refers to is the withdrawal of projections. I told you what happens when the projection drops off. Death follows. Okay, we're not talking about physical death here. We're talking about psychological death of some part of the psyche. Now, two new things show up in picture 7. The little homunculus signifying the soul and the cloud. Jung remarks about this in Psychology of the Transference, quote, "The psychological interpretation of this process leads into regions of inner experience which defy our powers of scientific description, however unprejudiced or even ruthless we may be. At this point, unpalpable as it is to the scientific temperament, the idea of mystery forces itself upon the mind of the inquirer, not as a cloak for ignorance, but as an admission of his inability to translate what he knows into everyday speech of the intellect. I must therefore content myself with a bare mention of the archetype which is inwardly experienced at this stage, namely the birth of the divine child, or, in the language of the mystics, the inner man," unquote. So Martin says, religious, let me get back. Eric says, confusion is the mother of wisdom. I would say that's true. Let me try this grenade in terms of the difference between soul and spirit. Soul is what makes you happy. Spirit is what makes you act. Martin says, religiously, a person is a soul that has a spirit, I think. So soul is the life, I guess, from how the breathing example and the leaving in which they saw mist when Skip was talking about breathing. So the spirit would be the non-physical element, I guess. Well, the soul and the spirit get joined, and so at that time they're separated from the body and they're both non-physical. And Buzz says, I think the spirit is a reference to alchemy, perhaps a physical essence of the human, as a liquor can be distilled into a spirit. Yeah, I have to think about this a little bit, but anyway. And, okay. So, moving on here. So Jung takes the emergence of this little homunculus figure to represent the birth of the divine child, the inner man, and it's born out of the death of the body, meaning death of the concrete level of human existence, the level of participation mystique I've already alluded to. The new entity appearing in picture 7 is the cloud, and it's very important. The cloud is one of the age-old symbolic images of the transpersonal reality. It's how the numinosum manifests. Let me give you a few examples just to remind you. For instance, in antiquity, Zeus was represented as seated on a cloud. For the Israelites, during their wanderings in the wilderness, Yahweh went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire. Yahweh came to Moses in a cloud on Mount Sinai. We read, quote, "The cloud covered the mountain, and the glory of Yahweh settled on the mountain of Sinai. For 6 days the cloud covered it, and on the 7th day Yahweh called to Moses from inside the cloud," unquote. When Solomon's temple was completed, it was meant quite literally to house Yahweh. The Ark of the Covenant was placed in it, and the cloud filled the temple of Yahweh. So Yahweh came into this temple in a cloud and occupied it, because that was his dwelling place. A cloud overshadowed Mary at the time of the Annunciation. Quote, "The Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the power of the highest shall overshadow thee," unquote. Luke 1:35. And at the transfiguration of Christ, quote, "A bright cloud covered them with shadow, and from the cloud there came a voice," Matthew 17:5. In Revelation, the coming of the apocalyptic Christ is described thus, quote, "And I looked and beheld a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle." Revelation 14:14. Well, that will be enough to demonstrate that the cloud is an expression of the numinosum. And so at this point I need to give you back the other image that led this out. Okay, so this is an alchemist getting the image of God out of a cloud. One finds pictures in the alchemical texts of an alchemist praying, kneeling on the floor in his laboratory, and God in a cloud is instructing him how to continue with his experiments. These are all relevant associations to the meaning of the cloud, which now appears here for the first time, following the experience of death. This is characteristic, for the death of the ego is a necessary prelude to the theophany. You see, it's the same as the sequence of the death and rebirth of the year spirit. Okay, so that is image 7, picture 7. And let's see. So Buzz says the soul seems to be something which exists outside of the being and is joined but leaves at death to go elsewhere. I think as far as we know scientifically today, Buzz, that is correct. The Grenade says, Buzz, do you know if alchemic thought comes before Abrahamic religions? I believe it does not, because Abrahamic religions began with Abraham, who lived about between 15 and 1700 years BC, and alchemy started around the 2nd or 3rd century, so it came almost 2 millennia later. Buzz says, I think it came as a result of thinking it seems to be early in China and occurred later in the West, I think, as a result of the Silk Road. Yeah, maybe. That may be quite true, because Confucianism and Taoism go back quite a bit farther than Christianity. And the first Emperor Qin believed in Taoist immortality and took mercury, which apparently killed him. Eric says, silly rabbit. Yeah, that's the problem, because we keep confusing things that have to change in the psyche with things that have to change in the physical world. And so, for example, we have 22 veterans in the U.S. commit suicide every day. And, that's a huge tragedy. But part of why that is happening is men in war see truly horrific things, and it induces post-traumatic stress syndrome. And so even I have a very mild case of that. So from my own experience, I can say that every time that a helicopter flies over my house, which happens at least 2 or 3 times a day, because I have the U.S. Naval Academy 2 miles from here, and every time I hear fireworks, both of those times, it immediately puts me back in Vietnam. And it's quite painful, because then I have to deal with all the painful images that I saw at that time. And in the case of fireworks, I really cannot watch a fireworks display except on television. If I'm outside watching down the river as they're shooting fireworks over the Naval Academy, it makes me want to climb a tree. It's just terrible. And so what we need to understand is that doesn't mean I should commit suicide. It means I have to know how to control that particular neurosis. And because I'm conscious of it, because I know that that's happened, I now avoid fireworks displays except on television. And I can't avoid the helicopters, but I try not to listen when they fly over. And Buzz says, have you heard Sam Stone by John Prine that he wrote of The Problem? No, I haven't. Buzz says, sorry, sir, that must be tough on you. Okay, well, that it's nowhere near as tough on me as people who were in the worst kind of combat. And my own experience in Vietnam was relatively mild, I readily admit. And so therefore my case of PTSD is relatively mild, but it makes me know that it must be very tough for the guys that are committing suicide. And so somehow they need the guidance to know that those things can be cordoned off in the psyche and one can go on living. That's, I guess it's the cost of being a male. And, typically it's men who fight wars. I mean, we're getting more and more women into it, but for the most part, over the centuries, it's been men, and so men have had to carry the consequences, the psychological consequences of those wars, and so I am nowhere near suicidal over those issues. Now, I don't know why, but can you still hear me? Because I had a brief, I guess it's working still now. Can anyone hear me? So the U.S. Air Force flying their jets in formation just above me while snowboarding in West Virginia was one of the coolest things I've ever seen. They must have had a base nearby. Yeah, well, young men often think that it's very cool. The problem is that, what is it that you're doing when you're flying a jet and dropping a bomb? You don't really know whether the people beneath you are good people or bad people. I mean, we're getting better at targeting, but we don't necessarily know what's in the target. And so these things can be quite difficult, even if you have this distant, the ability to be disconnected from the reality. Okay, now in my case, I had a Marine die in my arms, and I had an experience with enemies who had literally had their face shot off, and so actually I shouldn't be going back there, I guess. Okay, it seems that things are working again, even though the stream health seems to be bad, so I'm going to keep at it. And this is potentially serious viewing issues right now. Now it's getting better. It's improved. Okay. All right. So actually I was done with picture number 7. So what I'm going to do is go offline for a couple of minutes while I set up a separate video for picture number 8, because I'd like them to be separate in the YouTube channel. And so I hope you have time to stick around. I should be not more than 5 minutes doing this, and then we'll start talking about the solutions, which are very valuable to us, and that comes from picture 8, which is Gideon's dew drips from the cloud. Okay, so I will be back in a few minutes with picture number 8.